Gretchen Rubin is a two-time New York Times bestselling author. Her books, Happier at Home and The Happiness Project, many of you I'm sure have read. The Happiness Project has been on the New York Times bestseller list for about 2 years now. And I'm thrilled to tell you that today Gretchen is actually going to share with us a sneak peek into her forthcoming book that she actually hasn't even finished yet. She's still working on it. So she's learned some exciting new insights into, of course, the field of designing for habits. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce my good friend, Gretchen Rubin.
As Nir said, I have been writing and thinking about happiness for years, and one of the things that I started to notice is that when you talk to people about their happiness challenges, the subject of habits comes up over and over again. That a lot of times the challenges that people face are the habits they want to make or break. Whether it's something like getting off of email so you can go to bed on time, or not binge watching Downton Abbey in 1 week, or whatever. Habits came up over and over. Now, my focus is on the individual, how we as individuals can change our habits. But of course, it has enormous implications for thinking about people that you work with, people that you live with, or clients that you're trying to encourage to have habits or to change habits. But the thing that struck me, and maybe the same thing has occurred to you, as I began to do the research on habits, is I was like, you know, am I the only one who notices something weird here? I mean, am I the only one that's noticing these questions? Because I kept finding that there was this unspoken assumption in everything that I was reading, that people have the same aptitude for forming habits, that they have the same attitude towards forming habits, and that if we could only find the perfect method, we would be able to change everyone's habits equally effectively. And I thought, that's not true. That's obviously not true, right? I don't need a Stanford lab with 300 undergraduates eating marshmallows tell me that's not true. People are very different when it comes to habits. But how do you know the difference among people? And this is the secret to happiness. Listen to me. The secret to habits. Your nucleus accumbens, what is it? Is firing now. What is the secret to habit formation? What is the secret? The secret is self-knowledge. Because when we're trying to make or break a habit, it's absolutely essential that we take into account our own nature, our own values, and our own interests. And whenever anyone tries to come up with a perfect one-size-fits-all solution, it's going to work for some people for whom it's a good fit, and then there will be other people for whom it is not a good fit, and it won't work. And so any time to change a habit, the first thing to say is, well, what am I like? What's going to work for me? But the thing that's funny about habits is that it's kind of hard to know yourself. And you sort of think, well, I mean, what's so hard about knowing yourself? I mean, all you do all day is hang out with yourself. What's the big mystery? But we are so easily distracted by what we think is true, or what we assume is true, or what other people tell us is true, that we lose touch with what is actually true about ourselves and how we can successfully form habits. And so the key thing is to know yourself. But how do you know yourself? How do you measure yourself? Now, it's interesting because in happiness, there's a lot of things you can do. Like if you want to measure personality, you can use the Big Five. There's a scale from 1 to 10 where you can measure how happy you are. I'm a 7, as it turns out, on the 1 to 10 scale. But with habits, it was like I couldn't figure out any way to measure myself to have any sense of where I lined up with other people. I mean, I assumed that I was pretty much like everybody else, and everybody else was pretty much like me, but I just really didn't have a sense of it. And I was looking and trying to figure this out. And then I thought, okay, well, I'm just going to have to come up with it, because there doesn't seem to be a framework by which we can check each other and understand how different people would form habits differently. So here's the framework I've come up with. This is what I'm going to explain. I'm going to go through it quickly, and then I'm going to go through it and ask you to raise your hands, because I think it's going to be very interesting to find out how this group measures up. And then I'll talk for a little bit longer about how to think about these tendencies and how they might influence the way you think about yourself and other people. And then there'll be 10 minutes for Q&A at the end. So here we go. It sounds dry when I start, but I promise it's really useful. And these are called the Ruben Tendencies. I don't love the name, so if you have a better suggestion, come up to me afterward. These are the 4 Ruben Tendencies. And this has to do with how you respond to the idea of an expectation. And a habit is a kind of expectation. It's an expectation you put on yourself, or maybe like your doctor is trying to put an expectation on you, or your sweetheart. So here we go. Now, there are outer expectations, and Nir sort of alluded to this. I use the term slightly differently, but outer expectations are things like a deadline or a request from a spouse. An inner expectation is something like your own desire to get back into running, your own desire to keep a resolution. So, first tendency, upholder. Upholders respond readily to outer expectations and inner expectations alike. They can keep a resolution, they can meet a deadline without much effort. Next, questioners. Questioners question all expectations. They will meet an expectation only if they believe that it makes sense. They have to believe that they're persuaded. So in a way, they make everything an inner expectation. Then, rebels. Rebels resist all expectations, outer and inner alike. If you ask or tell them to do something, they won't do it, and they very likely will want to do the opposite. And then, obligers. Obligers respond readily to outer expectations, but they have a lot of trouble imposing expectations on themselves. Like my friend who said, when I was in high school, I was on the track team, and I never missed a track practice. Why can't I go running now? Because she can respond to outer expectations, but not inner expectations. Okay, so here we go. First up, upholders. We respond readily to outer and inner alike. That's my category. Okay. Next, questioners. Questioners make everything an inner expectation. Okay. Next, rebel. Resist all expectations, outer and inner alike. Finally, obliger. Yeah. And who doesn't find themselves in this framework at all? So this is very interesting because this group exactly represents everything, what I've seen completely anecdotally, but universally. Rebel is a tiny category. Very few people are rebels. But the thing that was the revelation to me as an upholder is almost no one is an upholder. That's also a very small category. I thought I was pretty much like everybody else. I'm on the freaky fringe. Most people are questioners or obligers. This has enormous implications for thinking about how to get people to change their habits. Because some things are going to work on just about everybody, because they work with upholders. And some things, some people aren't going to do in practically any circumstance, because those people are rebels. The question is, how do you get to the questioners and the obligers? So now I'm just going to run through quickly to a little bit more deeply on each of the categories. And then again, we'll have questions, which is always my favorite part. The thing about upholders, they wake up in the morning and they think, what's on the to-do list? What's on the schedule? They like to know what's expected of them. They meet those expectations or surpass them. They want to know the rules. They sometimes go beyond the rules in things like technology or ethics or art. They're looking for the rules beyond the rules. They're very good at self-starting. They don't need a lot of accountability. They don't need deadlines. They don't need supervision. If they say they're going to do it, they're going to do it. And they also have a very strong instinct of self-preservation because their own expectations for themselves are just as important as the expectations that others impose on them. So they will go for a run. They will say, I need to stop answering emails from work because I need a full night's sleep, because of the pressure that they feel from inner expectations. But there are downsides to everything. All these categories have upsides and downsides. And there's a relentlessness to upholders. They can be kind of dreary for other people to be around. And they can be tiring for themselves because they just will uphold. My law school roommate is also an upholder, and she just happened to mention to me that she'd missed going to the gym like 6 times in a couple of years. And to me, I was like, that's pretty cool, because I'm an upholder. Most people are like, She's crazy. Like, she's so rigid. That's not healthy. Because that's the kind of person that she is. And it can be tiring to be around that. And they can also become sort of paralyzed if they get into a place where it's not clear what the rules are or the rules are ambiguous. They can be overwhelmed and not successful. Then questioners. Questioners wake up in the morning and think, what needs to get done today? They're very motivated by sound reasons. They have to be persuaded. If you tell them to take a pill, it's like, why this pill, not that pill? Why in the morning? Why not at night? Why should I take it at all? Why should I listen to you? If you're thinking to yourself, I question the validity of the Ruben Tendencies, you're a questioner. They must be persuaded. The worst thing that they can say is that something is arbitrary. If you say to a questioner, do you keep a New Year's resolution? They'll say to you verbatim, I would never keep a New Year's resolution because January 1st is an arbitrary date. If something's important to me, I do it right away. That's a questioner. Bizarrely, and I don't really have an explanation for this, questioners hate to wait in line. I don't know why that is. It just keeps coming up over and over again. Questioners can be great to work with. They're intellectually engaged. They love information. They want to know more. And it's very healthy to be around people who are saying, why are we doing it this way? Why are we doing it at all? But the same thing, there's an upside and a downside. It can be annoying and tiring for people to be around that relentless questioning. And even in the questioners will sometimes complain of it. They'll say things like, I was going on vacation and I'm just spending way too much time researching it. Like, it's not a good use of my time and my energy. A questioner said to me, I have analysis paralysis. I can't make up my mind until I have perfect information. And the fact is, as we all know, in many circumstances, it's not possible to have perfect information. You have to act. And so questioners, and questioners also, interestingly, come in two flavors. Some have a tendency to uphold. They're pretty easy to convince. Some are practically rebels. It's very, very hard to convince them to do something. And one thing about questioners is that they can become kind of crackpot. They come up with their own ideas. They arrive at their own conclusions, and you're sort of like, it's like my friend who's a questioner with a rebel tendency, who was like, his doctor was telling him what he needed to do for chemo, and my friend was like, yeah, I kind of disagree with you on that, so I'm going to go my own direction. It's like, and everybody was like, why do you think you know more than your cancer doctor? But he just arrived at his own conclusions. And you see that over and over again with questioners. Sometimes it's very sound, but then sometimes it can kind of veer into sketchiness. Next, rebels. So rebels wake up in the morning and they think, what do I want to do today? They want to do what they want to do. And if you ask or tell them to do something, they will not do it. And you will very likely ignite in them the spirit of opposition. Now, it can be great to be around a rebel. It can be great to be a rebel because they are so in touch with what they want. They know what they want. They're not afraid to go outside of the box. They love going outside of the box. Usually rebels love to flout convention and expectation. It's tremendously freeing. And obviously there's enormous social value in some circumstances to have somebody who's willing to just resist and rebel. But upside downside, it can be very difficult to work with someone or be someone who wants to do the opposite of whatever you ask or tell them to do. I mean, to the point where with some rebels, if I say, oh, read this book, you're going to love it. I'd be like, I'm not going to read it. I hate it. Like there's just an automatic pushback. Rebels will even say things like, the minute I move somewhere, I feel like there's an expectation that I live there, so I want to move again. Seriously, if you've read Out of Sheer Rage by Jeff Dyer, he describes this very eloquently, this constant kind of resistance that rebels feel. Or like a rebel who said, like, oh, if you say to me, will you empty the dishwasher? It's like, well, I was going to, but now you've asked me, so no, I'm not going to. So when you're with a rebel, you have to be very careful not to ignite that spirit of opposition. They want to act out of choice. They want to act out of freedom. So a rebel would not say something like an upholder would say, I run every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 8 o'clock a.m., and they just stick to that. A rebel, I choose to run today. I feel like running today. How much I love to run. I love being outside. I love experiencing the weather. I love listening to music. I love being free from the gym ripping me off. they want to feel free. They want to make choices. They will do something for you out of love for you, but not out of obligation. Here's something interesting. Every rebel I know who's in a long-term relationship is with an obliger. So now we turn to obligers. Obligers wake up in the morning and think, what do I got to do today? Or else I'm going to get in trouble. What must I do today? And this is the key thing about obligers, they are motivated by external accountability. This is the absolutely crucial factor about obligers. And as I said, this is a very, very big category of people. They must have external accountability. It's not about motivation. It's not about desire. It's about accountability. Now, obligers are the rock. Obligers come through for you. Obligers meet expectations. They don't want to disappoint. They don't want to let people down. They don't want to make mistakes. They are going to come through. They're going to proofread your report when they haven't finished their own report. So they're great to have around for other people. Really, it's an obliger who carries the burden of being an obliger, because obligers have a hard time meeting those expectations for themselves, so they burn out. They say things like, why do I make time for everybody else's priorities, but I don't have time for my own priorities? It's because there's no external accountability. And if you talk to obligers, many have very cunningly figured out a way to create systems of external accountability for things they want to impose on themselves. Like a friend of mine who said, well, I wanted to get into photography, but I knew I would never do it, so I signed up for this class. And I took classes for several semesters, and I got really good at it, I got really into it. And then I thought, well, I don't need to take a class, because I know what I'm doing, and I love taking photographs. Guess how many photographs I've taken? 1. Or my friend who said, well, I signed up for a yoga class, and I went once. It was the $300 yoga class. There have to be these systems of external accountability. And those can be, and this is in terms of like product design and things, it's interesting because there are different sensitivities of obligers. Some obligers, it might be enough for them to get an auto respond in the morning saying, have you done X? And that might make them feel like, ooh, somebody's watching me in some kind of distant way, I better do what I think. But then for some, it's like, it's not enough to be on a team, on your phone with like everybody's tracking their distance. They actually need to have a real person who's going to be annoyed with them to give them a sense of accountability. So there's a lot of different sensitivity in how much accountability people have. Many obligers feel very accountable to their own duty as role models, like my friend who only eats vegetables when his children can see him. And here's an interesting thing about obligers. They have a streak of rebellion. I don't know if you obligers out here have experienced this in yourself, but often, like, weirdly, they'll just pick something seemingly at random, and they'll just put their foot down, and they won't do it. They have this obliger rebellion. But for the most part, it's really this idea of they want to choose what they want to do. They don't want to be captured by somebody else's rules. They don't want to be locked into habits. They resist habits because they fear them. It's like a cage. I said, as an upholder, I feel I give myself limits to give myself freedom. And a rebel said to me, that doesn't make sense because freedom means no limits. So these are just very different ideas of thinking about what a habit could be. A friend of mine said, I've been married for 5 years and I love my husband, but I have a problem with monogamy. I don't like people telling me what I can and can't do. What's important here is to think about how people's different perspective is going to influence very dramatically how they approach habits. Because for an obliger, it's all about that external accountability. And how do we build it? Is it health coaches? Is it executive coaches? Is it an app that's going to email you? Is it a professional organizer? Is it a financial planner? What are those things? For a questioner, it's about getting that data, believing, being convinced, this is the thing, this is going to matter. For a rebel, this is what you choose, this is what you want, this is what you like. And an upholder, it's like, you said you did. You said you wanted to, so okay, go for it. So then the last thing I would say, before I open it up for questions, is there's this amazing quotation by the novelist John Gardner, where he says, every time you break the law, you pay. And every time you obey the law, you pay. And I think for all of us, with wisdom and time, you hope that you would be able to see how to counterbalance the limitation, whether it's through technology or accountability partners or whatever it might be, that you would see how to counterbalance the negatives of your tendency so that you really can shape your life to reflect your true nature, your true values, your true interests, and so that your habits can take you closer to the life that you want. So thank you.
Let me just make a quick announcement. So I need to ask everyone for a bit of a favor. We've got some folks sitting on the floor, unfortunately, but there should be enough seats. So if there's a lot of seats here and there. If everyone can move towards the center, so if there's any empty seats, let's leave them on the ends, please. And if you have any questions, please go ahead to one of the microphones on the sides.
Okay, gold star for the person who's asking the first question. Oh, I don't think it's on. Mir, I don't think it's on.
So as a psychiatrist, I loved your presentation. I'm curious about two things. With so many different models like this, I think the true test of whether these are in fact types or not is to see how people look when you put them in the scanner. You know, are there any physiologic correlates to this with brain imaging? And I wonder if that's a question that could be addressed. But the second thing is I wonder about how people would define themselves relative to others. So it seems to me very possible that you could take a questioner and put them in an environment of rebels, and it might bring out a different side in them. Or, you know, that you could be in a relationship with a different person, and it would bring out a different tendency. I don't think it's as fixed and rigid as what you've described, although I think they are nice kind of building blocks to start the thought process. Yeah. But I wonder your thoughts about that, about how people react relative to others.
Well, I'm so glad that you pointed that out, because I think that this is a huge issue within habits and something that isn't nearly looked at enough, which is how do people affect each other. We tend to think of individuals acting like kind of by themselves, and I myself definitely have a tendency to do that. And the way that we act in context, that social deviance that Nir mentioned, how much we're always so influenced by the way other people act. So certainly, if you were an upholder with a bunch of obligers, you know, it would bring out different parts of you. But I have to say, and again, this is totally unscientific. I just made this up, right? So its only validity comes if it's ringing true for you. If you feel like, wow, I feel like something in the world is explained to me in a way that I didn't see before. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to scientifically prove it. I'm trying to just prove it observationally. In my observation, people are pretty settled in these categories, and it's very persistent throughout the way that they see the world. And you can put them with somebody else, and they might change somewhat, but they don't change dramatically, even in the smallest ways. Like an obliger friend of me said, oh, we're taking our kids to France for the summer. And I thought, would it be more accurate to say that you decided to go to France and you're bringing your children? Why are you framing it in terms of a duty to your children? You're going to France for fun, you know? But this is the way she sees the world. And so I think actually people are more in these categories than you might think. It might, people will say, I'm a questioner in some ways, and I'm an upholder in some ways and an obliger in other ways. Usually when I kind of push, it's not so much. These categories tend to be pretty solid. Yeah.
You mentioned that rebels tend to pair well with obligers.
Yes.
Who pairs well with upholders like us?
Oh, are you an upholder? Oh, the few, the proud. Well, I will tell you from experience.
The writers.
That upholders, from what I've observed, I'm married to a questioner with upholder tendencies. And truly, I think upholders would do well with upholders with tendency to uphold, and maybe obligers. But that rebel thing is very hard for them. And even obliger, because obliger doesn't have that duty to self, and that can become, to an upholder, very stressful. I get very agitated when I'm around people who can't do what they say they're going to do, even for themselves. Mm-hmm. I think it would be hard for me to be married to someone like that. So
Thank you.
Do you have a life partner? What's their category?
I think my husband is an obliger.
Oh, really?
And I'm usually encouraging him to prioritize his internal expectations.
Yeah. Well, now you just make him accountable to you. Then your problem solved.
I do.
Yeah.
I made him my CTO.
Yeah. Yes.
Have you found in your experience that certain people tend to, or certain careers tend to attract certain types of these people?
That's such a good question, and I haven't actually done that. But I do occasionally. I hear from people who are kind of having this epiphany of like why they're not happy. Like I got a funny email from a guy who was like, "Well, now I know why I hate my job because I'm a tax accountant and I'm a questioner." And if you know anything about tax accounting, it's like it doesn't make any sense. It's like, why are the rules like this? They don't make any sense, but you have to impose them anyway. So I think I haven't actually done that, but I think the fact is it is a fit, that for some people it would be really, certain professions would be much more interesting. But here's the weird thing about rebels. Rebels are attracted often to areas of lawlessness and disruption. So you can see why that would be. But they're also attracted to the military, to the police, to law, to the clergy. And I was so surprised by this. So I was asking on my blog, and a clergy person, rebel, wrote to me and said, well, as a clergy, you're kind of above the law. You are the person who's giving the law. Even if you have a very strong church governance, you kind of do what you want. And I was like, ooh. And then what about the military? And like, there's just this weird reversal that can happen, or these unexpected things, just the way obligers will rebel. And then one rebel said, like, I like to be in a very regulated environment because I can go home and think, look at all the things I was supposed to do today that I didn't do. I was like, well, that's one way to get job satisfaction. But I want to look more at that. I think it's a really interesting question. Yeah.
When you're designing a product and you have triggers, how do you keep from turning off these other groups? Is there any rule of thumb? So if something that'll work for a rebel, the way you do an alert, or you're trying to build a habit formation that would turn off someone else, is there any rule of thumb?
I don't know, and I think it depends so much on what the product's intended to do. Like a product that's intended to be fun, like this is what you want, this is fun for you. But if it's like, oh, remember you're supposed to take your blood pressure medication, that's a different kind of alert. So I think part of it is what is the person being reminded of, and how. And again, like with something like accountability, sometimes you have something that is meant to trigger a feeling of accountability, but it may not, depending on what an obliger is. So it's very dependent on what it is, what's the purpose behind the product, and how that interacts with what the person is trying to do. But that, again, is something that I want to think about much more closely as this like just about killed me to come up with this framework. But yeah, I want to push deeper into that. It's a very important question.
A little bit about how different social situations can just have people display different aspects across this quadrant. And I'm curious about maybe different economic situations or cultural, and how that can drive just different displays of those behaviors you've described.
Well, I really think that people pretty much stay solid in their tendency. I think it might slightly change depending on who's around them. And I'm not sure that I think that it would matter that. I think this is just your way of approaching the world. And that I don't think it would change that much depending on that kind of thing. But I forgot to tell one of my favorite rebel stories. A friend of mine had a rebel father. And they went to the doctor, and the doctor's like, oh, my goodness, you're in a high-risk category, sir, and you're going to die if you don't take this medication immediately, and you have to do it, and it's very important. And went on and on and on about how important it was to take the medication. And they got out on the street, and my friend said, her father said, what do you think? Should I take the medication? And she said, I wouldn't bother. He said, what? You want me to die? And he takes it. The levels there, right? So it's just very important to understand how you're going to kick off a response in somebody. The thing that might work for an obliger might be exactly the wrong thing to do for somebody else. Exactly. Saying to somebody, you're doing just what the doctor said. It's great. It's like, oh my gosh, now I'm immediately going to stop, or vice versa. Yes?
You kind of anticipated my question. I'm apprehensive. You mentioned that with rebels, you can kind of backfire when you ask them to do exactly what you want them to do. And so you gave an example right now of reverse psychology.
Yeah.
How do you balance that with the fact that they're a minority case? So if I'm creating in my product kind of almost negs going against what I want the behavior to be, aren't I then going to be turning off the other 90%?
Yes, and no, and I think this is one of the reasons why it's important to understand how they fit into the framework. Because I remember talking to a guy who's a behavioral economist, and we were talking about medication compliance, which is a huge thing when it comes to habit formation. And I was saying, but what do you do about those people that just like the more you tell them to take your medication, the less they will? And he goes, oh, well, in our studies, we just dropped those people out. And I was like, okay, that's cool. I didn't know you could do that. So I think sometimes you might just have to say, like, well, this just isn't going to work for a rebel mentality because it's just not going to work for them choosing. Or I might have to take it, like have a completely different advertising campaign, or I might have to have a completely different way of approaching them and trying to bring them in because they're going to want to choose, they're going to want to act on their own. Now, I will say one thing that's dangerous about being a rebel is that they can be manipulated by their spirit of opposition because, resistance is not obedience, but it is not freedom. And so if you say, I don't think a kid like you can go to a good college. And they're like, I'll show you. I mean, that's using psychology. So, but they are I have spoken to groups where there are no rebels. So it is a very, very small category of person. If you're talking about like how to design a mass product, they come at the world in a very different way.
Can I have a second question?
Yeah, last question.
Sorry. So if I was going to ask one question in a survey to my users to be able to identify and segment them as which category they were in, what would you recommend that question be?
Well, I just came up with a quiz that has many, many questions that people do. I don't think that there is one because
they have
everything...
attention span of one question.
Yeah, I know. I get it. The problem is that they overlap. So like obligers and upholders both respond readily to external obligations. And, and questioners and upholders both respond readily to inner expectations. So you can't just ask one question because you're always going to get overlapping groups. Because some people, it's a diagram where there's a lot of overlap. But that is an excellent intellectual challenge, which as an upholder I cannot but try to meet, and so I will try to figure that out. So thank you very much.